This is the Cruciform Conversations podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Well, welcome to Cruciform Conversations. Today's conversation is a continuation of the Cruciform Sexuality series, where we're trying to just expand our imagination for sexual ethics that reflect and embody the self-giving love of Christ. And my guest today is so good that you were going to rise up and call me blessed for having her on. It is, in fact, the one and only Dr. Kelcie Vercel. Kelcie, thank you for joining me today.
Well, you know, it's my pleasure. You are one of my favorite people to talk to. So glad to be here.
Hey, what's better than that? And I asked Kelcie to join me because as a sociologist, she teaches and researches the lived experiences of actual people. And sometimes when we get in these conversations around ethics and theology and scripture, it can feel really distant from what people are actually doing, what they're choosing, what their lives look like. And I think it's connecting those two things is really vital to do this well. Hopefully, Kelcie's going to help us do that. Well, before we get into that, let me introduce you to Kelcie and some of her work. She's an associate professor of sociology at Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is an awesome town. Love visiting it. It's a great place to hang out.
Surprisingly cool.
Surprisingly cool. And she describes her work as work of a cultural sociologist, interested in people's everyday lives, focused on meaning and material culture. And she's done some really interesting research on fatherhood, the meaning of home, tattoo regret. That seems like it's its own podcast series, tattoo regret, and just inviting people on to talk about, here's what motivated the tattoo and here's what I learned.
That's a great idea.
Maybe just a TikTok channel. That probably a little short, like maybe a 2-minute deal, but I'm just going to give you that one for free.
Thank you.
She also has researched around sexual learning and in the middle of a collaborative project focused on the romance genre. So Kelcie brings all sorts of interesting ideas and research and thoughts to that. And she unquestionably holds the record as the podcast guest I have sung the most karaoke duets with.
I mean, is there someone who, were you to have them on the podcast, they would beat me?
No, absolutely
Excellent.
not.
It's top.
Absolutely. So like that's just a permanent record for at this stage.
Excellent.
So, all right. So Kelcie, you are indeed a sociologist, and some might wonder about this connection between sociology and theological reflections and ethical conversations, and really sort of not even understanding really what sociology seeks to understand about our world and culture. So you can just help us give a little bit of big picture perspective on some of that, about your approach to studying people and culture and how this offers us a helpful lens to some other disciplines.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking, because I know maybe more than some disciplines, people don't often know exactly what sociology is. I would say most often people think maybe I'm a social worker, or people think maybe I'm a psychologist, and both of those are totally understandable. And certainly so the work sociologists do can brush up against both of those. As I tell my students, sociology is less a content area and more an approach. So sociologists really study everything in social life. If it has to do with human behavior and the social world, sociologists study it. So it's more about the way that we study. So in our introductory classes, students get introduced to an idea called the sociological imagination, which comes from a mid-century sociologist, C. Wright Mills. And basically he said, this is what sociology is. It is the attempt to situate the individual and the individual's experiences within the broader cultural, historical, social context. And so both sort of making sense of how structural things like that could be like what's happening in the economy, or what's happening culturally, or like what's the historical moment, how that is affecting what individuals are experiencing, and then how people who are sort of situated differently in that context are choosing different things, doing different things, experiencing different things. So sociologists study a lot of the same topics that other social scientists do, whether that's like politics or culture or like individual emotions, even like psychologists maybe. But they are always looking to situate that within the broader structural context. And so certainly in thinking about the relationship to ethical choices, human behavior, I often tell my students that I think of sociology as a tool for empathy, because when you understand the context that a particular group or a person or some kind of social phenomenon that's happening that you might look at and be like, why in the world would that be happening? Why would people do that? Why would they make that choice? And when you understand the context, oftentimes people's behavior becomes like very rational and understandable and sort of legible. And so I think that makes us more empathetic people. I can say more about sociology if you want. I can say a lot more
That's
about
a really,
what it is.
really helpful. No, that's a really, really helpful overview. And the connection directly back to, as I operate as a contextual theologian, is that I've often said in explaining what contextual theology is, it's adding sociological tools to theological reflection of understanding who we are and what we bring into our encounter with God, not just what we believe, but why we believe it, whose voice comes out of our mouth when we speak, that we're not these rational creatures that just ex nihilo exist in the world. We've all been shaped and formed by the cultures we live in. And our ability to study and understand that culture adds a lot of insight into who we are and how we live in the world. And so I think what you just described is exactly what I hope we get into with these reflections, because those tools are so vital for actually understanding the really important conversations we need to have around what we're doing and how we're organizing our lives.
Totally. I mean, do you think, it seems to me as I was thinking about this before today, that in some ways, I think sociology, the sociological perspective maybe is almost particularly helpful in the United States because of the way that sort of the hyper individualism and then actually, like you just mentioned, like rational choice, like this idea that humans are these sort of maximizing, like strictly rational, very efficient human actors, which just like isn't what the empirical evidence says about how people act in the world.
Yeah.
And then sort of our sort of commitment to meritocracy and kind of the idea that people get what they deserve and that what they have reflects sort of their personal merit and effort. And I think all of those things get inflected in our theological conversations and our religious conversations, how we understand sort of moral behavior. And I think, there are other contexts, around the world and even, other traditions within Christianity that maybe are better at paying attention to the collective and thinking about the individual as part of that and thinking about the sort of the community's responsibility and role and power. But that, I think, is something that we struggle with often as Americans, especially raised in certain contexts where we maybe over focus or we like put the locus of explanation overly in the individual, if that makes sense, for how people act and behave.
Absolutely. And what it means is that we try to answer questions without ever really naming what is true. That's for me where it comes down to over and over again of like, we're talking about this thing, but we've never named the truth, which is what has actually shaped and formed you to believe or to do this thing. Not just are you arguing about within the container of your world, but what created your world? You didn't create your world. You were born into your world. So can we talk about that too? Because if not, it's hard to actually get anywhere. And especially I love your connection with empathy and compassion for that, is that the more we understand what has shaped ourselves and others, the far easier it is to just approach them with, rather than guilt or shame, to a sense of understanding and compassion and a desire and an ability to actually dialogue and move into their world.
Absolutely. I think that people can find it kind of threatening or kind of like it can shake you up a little bit because oftentimes sociology is sort of questioning things that people take for granted because the world you're born into then shapes what you see as normal. It shapes what you think of as the default, as like, this is just how it is. And so then when you start to sort of examine that and to recognize the ways that actually it is other ways in other places and for other people because of this and this and this reason, that can be destabilizing in a way. And so, something we talk about in my classes is that like this, like you said, like we're going to describe reality and we're going to try to do that accurately based on, good, valid research that's been done on different parts of social life. And some of that reality might be uncomfortable. Like it might, it probably will challenge the way you think the world should be, or maybe what people should do. But we have to be honest about what people actually do before we can have a conversation about sort of the moral implications or the ethical requirements for us.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Awesome. Well, that's a great foundation then to pivot into some of the specifics around what I wanted to get into with you. As been trying to understand culturally how we've been shaped to think about sex and meaning and how we take those experiences into our conversation with scripture and massive ethical questions, because it's clear my thesis has been that we have a diseased sexual imagination as evidenced by the actual lived experiences of sexual behavior. Not what we say we are, but what we're actually doing, especially as the American church, and how that shows up, and especially around issues around vulnerability and exploitation. But what we're doing rather than what we say we're doing reveals something's broken.
Mhm.
I'm hoping you can give us a little bit of insight into some of that. So through your research, through your teaching, when you come into that conversation, some of these ideas around the way in which sexuality works and the lived experiences of people and how they're being shaped for that, what are some of the things that have just you've discovered in your curiosity that have been insightful for you or have helped you make sense of that about people and their bodies and how they live in this and sexual experience and what's shaping generations?
Mm.
Give us some wisdom, please.
Oh, I don't know about wisdom, but I will. I do have. I was thinking about this. I started teaching as a grad student almost 10 years ago. And I've been teaching, as part of that, I've been teaching about sexual behavior because I started teaching sociology of families as a grad student. That's one of my areas of specialty. And so that includes, talking about sex and dating and partnering and, childbearing and like all those kinds of behaviors. And so thinking about, part of my responsibility as a professor is to think about like, what are my students bringing in with them to the classroom?
Hmm.
And especially, sociology is often, we're teaching about things that people feel like they know about already because they have experience with it. Like everyone's got a family of some kind. And so trying to understand where my students are coming from, and then what the research says broadly and helping them exercise their sociological imagination on their own experiences. Like how can they learn to situate themselves within the broader social world? So we talk about things like, where do our ideas about who is an appropriate partner, right? So we even, I do this exercise with students that's about the idea of social distance, like how similar or different someone is to you based on like social characteristics. And so I have them do this exercise where I ask them if their parents or their grandparents would object if they brought home a partner who was XYZ. I give them a series of things. And so it's things like of a different religion, of a different national background, of a different political ideology, of a dramatically different social class, if they were 10 years older or younger, like, and because they sort of just take it for granted, like who they perceive in the world as a potential partner. But part of what we unpack is like, where did that come from? Like, who gave you those ideas? And so often students then will draw on, oh yeah, well, I don't think my family would react sort of in any big way if I, brought home a partner who had a different religion or had a different race because my aunt is married to someone who has a different religion. You know what I mean? So they then can begin to see how the social worlds they have been brought up in have shaped their perspective on those kinds of things. So there's that aspect, thinking about socialization. And honestly, as part of that, I know something that you've been considering and thinking about in terms of, what is culturally shaping us when it comes to sex, like is about pornography. It's like that is, in the research on what young people are encountering and what they are, like what is shaping their understanding of what sex is, like that is very important and increasingly important. And so that is something we also talk about. And we talk about some of the research on that. I don't know how much, like, in terms of specifics, you're interested in me talking about in terms of, like, what is the research saying about young people and their exposure to pornography or, like, I don't know how much you're interested in.
Let's push in on that since you named that. The pornification of sexuality is a driving cultural force that I just don't think we can even really quantify the impact of what's happening, right? In an earlier conversation with my buddy Hank, who's an ethicist, we talked about how the OnlyFans as a platform has exposed that there is a seemingly endless, literally endless desire to pay for sexual content. It skews more towards younger women, but like that the economic expansion of that, it reveals that we live in a culture of consumption there's no tap to that. There's no sense that would, there's no ceiling on that at all. And so
Yeah.
that's exposing something. So yeah, give us, if you have some insights into someone that the research is telling us, or about the impact or the scope of it, that'd be really
Yeah.
helpful.
Well, I think like one thing I think about is that in the United States, sort of in particular, and the United States isn't like dramatically different from everywhere else on all dimensions, but there is kind of a particular tension or dichotomy in the US where, on one hand, we have this like pretty massive pornification of sex that like you and I lived. I mean, it sort of was like late 90s, early 2000s. There really was this like pretty dramatic change in sort
Mhm.
of pretty mainstream depictions of sexuality and sexual behavior. And of course, that's like coinciding with like the rise of the internet and the rise of like availability of pornographic material on the internet. But then we also, and I think, I think it's related to sort of our Puritan roots, we also have like a lot of silence about real sex, about like actually sex and what people actually experience and what people actually would like to experience. Like we actually don't have a lot of frank conversations about sex itself, but we have all of this sexualized content and media. And so I think, so like one thing in the United States, and this is really quite, I think, important for the role that porn is currently playing, is that we have really pretty dramatically uneven sex education, like throughout the levels of schooling. And that's because states have lots of sort of autonomy, and even like districts have like sometimes autonomy. And so there's just like huge variation, even in terms of like it's not even required to be medically accurate in all states. Like, so and so that's part of that kind of gap. And the US is also different in that, like, there are other contexts, and again, it's not all, but there are other countries where it's just really normalized for parents to talk frankly about sex with their kids. And I think like, and that's kind of where I think some of that Puritan influence kind of comes in, almost the sense of like, well, if we talk about sex, then young people will think about sex. And it's like, that's, they are going to think about sex. And so I think there is, and I think, and it's also like parents didn't have like good socialization around sort of frank, honest conversations.
No.
That weren't attached to shame or embarrassment, or like they also don't have the skills. And I think they feel like they don't have the skills. So what's happening is like porn is kind of filling that gap. Like young women, more so than young men's pornography consumption rates are somewhat higher than young women's, even though it is common among both. But young women are more likely to report that they use it like specifically for education, like not knowing something about sex and going to porn to look it up. Like, what is this thing that I've heard of? Or like, what is happening? And so,
wow,
and
that's
it's,
fascinating.
can I just say, porn's a lot of things. And of course, porn can be like very diverse in terms of what exactly it is, but it is not good for education, especially not what is most ubiquitously available to people. Because and we even like research on sort of like what is most popular on like, sort of mainstream porn sites indicates like at least some degree of rising popularity of scenarios that are coercive, violent, degrading, like just more. And so some of the research on young people's exposure. So one, and I think this is like inextricably linked to people carrying around a screen in their pocket that is connected to the internet. Like most people's first exposure to porn isn't porn that they saw it. It's that someone showed them, like an older kid or something. And so some of the research suggests that like it matters what age you're exposed at. It matters if you, and this just makes sense even in thinking about context, it matters if you encounter porn after you're sexually active or before, right? Because if it is serving as an important kind of source of socialization, like people are trying to figure out like what's normal, what's expected, what's a typical sexual encounter look like, and they don't have much information for that. I mean, like there is some evidence suggesting that like girls who are exposed earlier in life to porn that depicts those kinds of more violent, more coercive types of scenarios are more likely to actually, once they become sexually active, accept those kinds of behaviors and think that they're normal. And similarly, like young men who are exposed really early are more likely to like agree with what we would think of as like rape culture myths. And so like we can see that there is this relationship there. And it's not like, I think we always have to be, I don't know if like thoughtful or careful are the right words, but it's not, media doesn't sort of like directly and simply drive behavior, right? It's not like porn just causes people to do things in kind of a really simple linear way. But I think there is evidence of influence and impact and sort of how it's shaping people's perceptions of what's normal and what
Yeah.
they should expect.
Yeah. And how it's one of the influences shaping our desires and how we would live out those desires. And if we don't understand the scope of it and the impact, which does really helpful to think about the scope, the scale of the impact, the depths of it, and how it's being utilized, how it actually shows up, not just as sort of the blank evil, but as this is how it's actually influencing, shaping behavior and experience. Then as we talk about a sexual ethic in the church that is shaping us towards holy desire, towards good desire, towards redemptive desire, that understanding allows us to go, okay, well, in a world where coercion, violence, consumption of the other, the use of other, when that has infiltrated us to such a degree that whether someone has grown up in the church or not, this is in the water we're swimming in, this is the air we're breathing, it is going to show up. Then the church has to be more explicit, more intentional about mutuality, about the redemption of that, about how to deal with the shame of that, about how to help those who've been victims of it, about those who have been malformed by thinking this sort of sexual domination is the means of their fulfillment of desires, right?
Yeah.
If we know that, then we can think about how to form a redemptive community. But if we just act like it's out there rather than in here, we have no imagination for how to reshape our communities for that.
Well, absolutely. And I think that the church, and I think that the sort of research on this and thinking about sexual behavior, and I'm thinking particularly about research on sexual behavior between opposite sex partners, that there's also, and I think the church has to deal with the gendered nature of that because, and I know, I think it was the most recent episode of this series, right? Thinking about sort of purity culture and modesty and these sort of patriarchal ideas that are sort of get inflected with certain religious sort of meaning and justification in the church, but are very similar to the broader culture in terms of, right? So one of the ideas we talk about to help students kind of unpack and examine the social world that they experience is the idea of a sexual script, which just means the idea that sexual scripts would be a subset of what sociologists would call a cultural script, which is just that for familiar types of situations that we might encounter, we have learned throughout the course of our life that there's kind of a template for what's supposed to happen, right? So we would have a cultural script for how you should act in a classroom, what a first, what a job interview is like, what a first date is like, right? We kind of know, well, what do you do on that kind of, in that kind of situation? Who's there? How do you dress? How's it going to unfold, right? We have an understanding of that. We learn that across the course of our life so that, it's not every time you walk into a new classroom, you're I have no idea. What happens in a classroom? What's a class like? We learn it. And the same thing is true for sex. So we have a sense culturally of what a sexual encounter includes. With whom would you have one? What comes before what in the sort of trajectory of the interaction, right? We have a sense of those things. And so I was I don't remember where I was going. So we would say that the sort of the dominant sexual script is highly gendered in terms of the roles that men and women play in them, right? So if we think about some of that kind of purity culture stuff that really reflects a broader kind of patriarchal understanding of gender roles, right? This sense that oh, well, men are initiators. They are the, and women are sort of objects of desire. They're passive. Speaking of what does the research say on people's behavior? So young adults, there is a pretty decent sized body of research looking at not assaultive experiences. There's lots of research also on campus sexual assault. And we talk about that in my courses, but there's kind of this maybe more ambiguous area that is generally described as unwanted sex, but it's not sex that was assaultive. It's sex where the person is reporting, say in the interview study or whatever, the research is that they didn't really want to have sex, but they kind of felt obligated to, or they felt like the kind of barriers to getting out of that situation were like a little risky, so they weren't directly coercive, right? They weren't like being forced. And this is true for men and women, but for different reasons. And the reasons really reflect that sexual script. That's sort of where I'm going. So for young men, so like college age, that's where this research was happening. They would say that they had experiences of unwanted sex because the sort of meanings of masculinity they had been socialized into said a sort of normal, masculine, heterosexual male is always interested in sex, always. If you were to not be interested in having sex, there's something wrong. And they even talked about experiences of being mocked or of being sort of like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Or of that sense being so strong that they just would never say, actually, you know what? I'm really not into this right now. Because there was this sense but that's what masculinity is interest in sex. Whereas women would report having unwanted sex. One, because there's a lot of research sort of suggesting women take on the role of sort of emotional management for men. So they would talk about, well, if I say no, I don't know what he's going to do. Like, is he going to get angry?
What emotions and scenario am I going to have to deal with as a consequence of this? And does that seem like more of an issue for me than dealing with sex that I maybe not want in this moment in dealing with?
Yes, exactly. And similarly, reflecting that kind of idea of a sexual script, they would say things like, well, like I had already like gone back to his house, so I kind of felt like I couldn't really say no. Or like, well, I had already done this much, so I kind of felt, right? So there's kind of this sense that like I'm beholden to this. And so again, it's like if we don't examine, right, this sort of gendered way in which people have received messages about, and I think like even that conversation about purity culture and sort of modesty, right, there is even more of that sense for women where it's like, just by showing your shoulders, maybe you have basically already consented or you've already suggested. This. Yes.
You started this engine.
Yes.
What could you bear responsibility for this? Yeah. Wow. And that script and how it plays out, going back to some other conversations around why do we care about patriarchy, purity culture, these would have been dominant forces in the evangelical imagination for sex, is that what the research has shown us is that the sexual fulfillment and experiences, how it's being practiced within the American church, especially in evangelical circles, has not been one of flourishing because of the limited imagination for these scripts. The limited ability to communicate, to really understand the mutuality of it, for women's experiences and insight and desires to be centered in that. And the extraordinary research out now naming that there's a significant number of specific physical issues and sexual response issues that have far higher rates within traditional evangelical marriages because of all of these cultural things that have shaped that. And this part of why we have to tell the truth about it and reimagine some of it because it's not working. It's not working.
No. I mean, I think, and I'm just like so grateful that you're having this conversation in so much detail and so explicitly, because it is something that I have been, sort of privately or in, my, the conversations I'm having informally, personally, like I feel like I've been saying this for years, like that it's just so evident, right? That if your message is basically a list of don'ts and wrongs, and there's no teaching around sort of, it's not informational, it's just prohibitive. Except once you get married in a heterosexual marriage, then you're good. And it's like, if there's no education around like actually developing a sexual ethic, actually pushing back against like these cultural frameworks that encourage you to see your partner, and especially if your partner is a female partner, really as an object for your fulfillment, like there is no way. That doesn't matter if you have gotten married. You're not suddenly going to develop those skills to be attentive, to be mutualistic, to be like, or even to have sort of because I think there's also like a lot of, even though like it's like no one's getting a good education, so of course no one feels comfortable with this, but there's almost a sense that like it would be, and I think maybe especially for men, like that you're expected to just know, and that it would be like wrong and shameful if you had to ask like what your partner would enjoy or like how things are going for them. But how in the world would you know? Like, I mean, like, so just this, this emphasis on sort of prohibition and sort of free pass, post-marriage free pass, like has just led to so much dysfunction. And it just in ways that are heightened in the church because of certain, I think, teachings and assumptions, but they mirror things that are outside the church as well, the types of dysfunctions that are other places.
Yeah. And when you ask the questions, which is what you do, but when you ask the questions and get to the real answers, it can be pretty surprising. I'll pull back the curtain a little bit here, right? As I'm the person who asks the questions also all the time. And I can remember some specific groups I've been part of that were all male clergy, where we had more and more accountability, and commitment to our friendships and got together regularly and talked. And I remember conversations around sex that initially sort of began with, and it was very scripted, of the like, how often, right, do you have sex with your wife?
Hmm.
Or probably the question is more often like, how often do you get to have sex
Mm-hmm.
within that script? And I remember those conversations, and they didn't particularly interest me. I just remember the conversations happening.
Mm-hmm.
But then I remember asking deeper questions about what men were learning in their marriage and what their sex life was teaching them about, like, sort of themselves and how God was at work in it, to some pretty stunned faces of like, what did Greg just ask? But I remember just sharing from my own experience. I'm like, well, here's what I'm learning about myself, or here's what's had to die within me. Here is what God has had to crucify within me that I realized was misshaped or wrong or wasn't helpful, that here was the redemptive work or healing I was experiencing. And that then began conversations and insights from men that they could tell it was the first time they'd ever named aloud some of these ideas, or here's an observation that I actually don't know how to have attached meaning to. And a space like that has been incredibly rare for me to encounter. I've tried to create it especially for the men I've discipled and led because they're hungry for that. As you talk to college students, as you talk to other people in your life, you get asked these questions of, what are the things people aren't talking about? Or what are the things that your students are facing that they just desperately need someone to give them the permission to talk about the actual lived experience of being people in the world?
I mean, it's like what I try to do in class, and it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard because people feel uncomfortable talking about sex. And then also I have moved to a part of the country where people are so deeply stoic, and it's sort of like very behind the curtain.
Upper Midwest,
Yes.
nice, but stoic.
Yes, very much.
Mm.
So I, try to just demystify a little bit, like to be, again, like because of the type of, discipline I'm in, presenting empirical research. Here's what we know. Here's what people are experiencing. Here's what people are doing. And so just even by naming some of those things, talking about them out loud, my goal is for that to be right, like, because I know that they're not experiencing that, most of them, through most of their educational or even other types of experiences. So it is trying to, I don't know, like turn the temperature down a little in terms of like, it's okay. Like it's okay to have questions. It's okay to not know. It's okay to want to like talk through things. Like we got to kind of like normalize that. And then, I mean, like, even so in my family's class that I'm teaching right now, we did some of this where we looked at recent research on sort of sex among young adults and like really a lot of these kind of same dynamics that we're talking about. And I asked, like, what would be like, and we talk about sexual script. And things like hookup culture provide one type of sexual script. Okay, we can identify there are some issues with this. If you were going to identify like some ethical principles, and I'm teaching a set of students who are diverse in terms of both like nationality, where they're from, but also religiously, like it's a diverse classroom. So I have lots of students who are from Christian traditions, but I also have Muslims and Hindi students and non-religious students, so it's a diverse set. But how can we talk about like what would be some guiding ethical principles? And they said things like mutuality, like mutual care and respect, right? Open communication and honesty, right? Vulnerability, because they recognize like in some of that like casual sex script that's sort of pretty prominent among a lot of young people, there is a real emphasis on not being vulnerable. So talking about like, okay, like what, to be, what does intimacy mean? So those kinds of things. And then I think, again, and this is just so, and we really name the porn thing, which I know they will, the majority of them will have encountered. And
Yeah.
so we talk about that. And then I also, in my introductory sociology class, I just started, because actually this is kind of a side note, but some of the research on hookup culture, I mean, it's changing. So I've been I think hookup culture, it's probably been about the last 20 years or so that's been like a pretty prominent phenomenon. But really in the last, and I think COVID has something to do with this, in the last 5 or so years, we're seeing even more broadly, but also in young adults, a sort of decreasing appetite for casual sexual encounters. So I think some of that is changing. So I actually, yeah, go ahead.
No, and the research I read recently was talking about how much less sex this generation is actually happening. Like
Correct. Correct.
Probably attached to that, but that the continually increase of disembodied community and whatever too just means there's actually a decreasing rates, which tells a story. I don't understand what all the elements of this story is telling, but that is part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like high school seniors, a significantly smaller proportion have had sex as seniors in high school, and those who have had fewer partners. Now, their use of birth control has also gone down among those who are having sex.
Other stories. More of the
there are
story to be
multiple
told.
stories.
More data.
There are multiple stories. Exactly. And there is sort of some indication, right, of some retreat from relational vulnerability generally among young adults, right? This kind of risk-averse orientation, which that's actually one of the things that I'm really concerned about, because deep relationship requires deep vulnerability, and that is risky. It will never not be risky. It's not possible for it not to be. That's really kind of a side note. That's, not just related to sex, but some of the more recent research that I was using this year, it came out in 2020. It's called Sexual Citizens, and it's a collaboration between an anthropologist and a sociologist. And part of what I love is the framework of Sexual Citizens actually really gets us into that ethics conversation, because part of what they're trying to do, again, is kind of zoom out from the individual behavior and think about what, you're part of a community and your choices have an impact on your community. And if you think of yourself as a sexual citizen, meaning you have agency, you have some you're sort of entitled to make your own autonomous sexual decisions, but that also means everyone else has that same right and that same agency. And so you, as a member of a collective that you're a citizen of, it's your responsibility to thoughtfully engage their citizenship. And I think that sort of blew students' minds in terms of it was just so different than any way that they had thought about sexual behavior. And so I just hear even what you said about these all men groups, part of what you're doing is you're giving them alternative cultural resources for making sense of sex and their sexual experiences and behaviors. And I just think that's extremely valuable work for the church to be doing. And it's I feel like the church can do that. I think there are rich insights and resources in terms of how can we grapple with our sexual experiences, desires, etc. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah. So as we're sort of wrapping up the conversation, can you name, just with your own rich and deep faith that shapes your work, and how thoughtful I know and how prayerful you are about that? What do you feel like is sort of the redemptive arc in this work you're getting to do, right? Because you're teaching as a professor, you're not running a ministry.
Right.
But it is kingdom work you are doing and understanding and getting to see and identify where there needs to be good news for your students as they're navigating this. So what for you is sort of that part of that redemptive arc, as for how this can help us find a more beautiful experience of being sexual creatures, but also of just naming and pointing people to there is
yeah. It's a great question. So I think on one hand, I hope that, part of what I tell my students is I have my personal convictions, and part of what I want to do is set them up to intentionally, purposefully, thoughtfully reflect on their own values and on the ways in which maybe the sexual or cultural scripts that they have learned actually encourage them to act in ways that are counter to their values. And identifying them can be empowering, right? To say like, I don't have to make that choice, actually. Actually, I can choose a better thing. And maybe, and I do think this is true, like knowing that there might be social pressure to act in a certain direction, just like naming that actually gives us some power to resist that thing. So like, oh, I understand why I'm feeling sort of like compelled to make a certain choice or to do a certain thing. But I've reflected on that enough to recognize like that's actually contrary to what I believe or to what I want for my life or the type of person I want to be in the world, and I can choose something different. So I do think of it as like opening up a space for them to think in that way. And I think for a lot of them, they haven't thought about their sexual behavior options, choices, like in that framework. And I think that's helpful for that opportunity. And then I also think like if by reflecting on these things, unpacking them, examining them, I hope and I think it makes them, or it can make them more generous, more thoughtful, more empathetic people and partners in the future or currently. And I think that's sort of a net positive as well. Yeah, some of it is just like inviting them to imagine a better, more life-affirming, flourishing way. And to like sort of, and I think too, I think the social and media landscape they have like come up in, like really sort of encourages a sense of despair, cynicism. Like this is just how like everything's just on fire. And everything's garbage, and that's just where we're at. And so like a more aspirational or hopeful picture of what's possible between humans is part of the invitation. Yeah.
That's beautifully articulated, and I know beautifully done in those spaces. So thankful for the great work you get to do, and I'm thankful that a whole bunch of students get to have you lead them through that experience, because it is a beautiful kingdom work, even if they don't know it.
Oh, thanks. Always trying, always learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Kelcie, thanks. That's your insight into some of those particulars is really helpful in thinking about the specifics of how, what I'm trying to offer as cruciformity as a lens of self-giving, mutuality, justice, being present, a more beautiful flourishing. I think some of those tools really help point to how we incarnationally move into this space. Because if we don't know what people are actually doing, feeling, and being shaped by, it is really hard to know what good news to offer them. And so I feel that was helpful to me, and I'm sure will be helpful to others. So thanks for taking your time to share some of your good insights with us.
Thanks for the invitation. Very happy to talk about it.
Great. Well, that now that you've received the invitation, you'll come back again because there's more stuff to talk about. We always more stuff to talk about. I have several people who've been like, I think we may just have to have a whole, wait, what did purity culture teach you? Conversation panel of the like, wait, what did you learn? How did this mess you up? Just like a confessional, like just a confessional podcast of all our stories.
Yeah, there's plenty to unpack there.
Yeah. So we'll invite you back to be part of that fun.
Yes, please. Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, Kelcie. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.